Okay, we're going to turn our attentions to the IPL this week, which begins on Friday with the reigning champions CSK, who are playing RCB. And that tournament goes on for 74 matches, the final on May 26th. So a long tournament this year. Some big names returning. Just a bit of a list that I made. Rishabh Pant, obviously back from his career or near career-ending injury from the car crash. Jasprit Bumrah, Shreyas Iyer, Pat Cummins, Mitchell Starc, Kane Williamson, Johnny Bairstow, who all missed the tournament last year. Some first-timers, Rachin Ravindra, Spencer Johnson, England players involved. My list that I made shows Moeen Ali, Phil Salt, David Willey, Johnny Bairstow, Liam Livingston, Chris Woke, Sam Curran, Josh Butler, Tom Kohler-Cadmore, Will Jacks, Tom Curran, Reece Topley, and Luke Wood, I noticed, Nas, was brought in yesterday as a late replacement. Lots of things have happened actually since we last spoke. The WPL has finished with RCB winning that. PSL finished a day or so ago with Islamabad United winning that. Australia have just called off their 3-match series against Afghanistan. England's women won last night, their T20 opening T20 against New Zealand. Some sad news from your county, Nas. Robin Hobbs, former leg spinner that you would have known a little bit, I should imagine. He's passed away, sadly.
Yeah, that was very sad news yesterday. I know Hobbsy and knew Hobbsy well, actually, not just from our Essex days, and I used to see him around the county ground, Chelmsford, but also him and his lad were associated with Hutton Cricket Club. And we used to see him down at Hutton where my boys play, my daughter played, and he always used to be there. County cricket, loved it. Club cricket, loved it. Genuinely nice, one of the nicest men on the planet, Hobbsy. So we're gonna miss him. Essex are gonna miss him. And there has been a lot happening, actually. I mean, I plugged Delhi to win. I thought I was going to get a WhatsApp from you saying, when I said who's going to win the WPL, I said, I can't see beyond Delhi. And then RCB from nowhere came and won that. Islamabad United, a last ball thriller. Late yesterday, they won that. So a lot of cricket happening out there. Nice to see you back in the cold of England.
Yeah, back at home and nice to be here. Now, for our IPL chat, we're going to be joined by Manoj Badale, who's principal owner or co-owner, however you want to term it, of Rajasthan Royals. They've had an interesting relationship with the IPL. They've won it once. They won it in the very first year. They were banned for a couple of years. They haven't won it since. They've had an up and down ride. They've got some very interesting players. I'm sure we'll talk to Manoj about Yashasvi Jaiswal, who made such an impression in that Test match series. I don't know whether you have a team in the IPL, Nas, but I imagine if you did, that Rajasthan would be your kind of team, because in the early days they were thought to be a bit of a penny pinching team. I noticed in that in the first year they spent less on their draft than or on their auction than other teams, but managed to walk away with it. Are they your team?
No, of course, Chennai, mate. Chennai boy, aren't I? I was born a 7-iron away from the cricket ground. So, yeah, I am a member of the Madras Cricket Club and I am Dhoni all the way. Chennai Super Kings, 5 times
What do
winners,
they do so
Chennai.
well? And they've won it 5 times. Mumbai have won it 5 times. What are Chennai doing so well?
Dhoni and Fleming. Just put those two together. I do think there's a little bit of that. And we're going to come on to it with Manoj. We're going to talk about the 100. We'll talk about all these franchises. But I like an affiliate. I guess it comes from success. If you have a successful side, you tend to keep the captain, the coach, similar players. So I think I like an affiliation with a side in any franchise tournament in the world. And I think that's what the IPL have done well. You know, Kohli is associated with RCB. He's a Delhi boy, born in Delhi, and but he is RCB. So I think that's where you've got to get to with these franchises. I noticed just recently people just sort of go from one minute they're playing in South Africa, and then I turn on my telly and the same player is playing in the Pakistan Super League, and you just get a little bit confused as to who plays for who nowadays. So I think the IPL actually does that pretty well. When I put on my telly, you know who the captain is, you know who the coach is, you know who the owners are, and there's a real story that's already been built.
Yeah, Stephen Fleming has been with Chennai since the outset, I think, which is a long time ago now. 17. This is the 17th edition. And Manoj, who's our guest, was there right at the start of it as well, taking a bit of a risk, I suppose, to invest in an unknown quantity, but it's proved to be a very shrewd and smart investment. Manoj, thanks for joining us. Great to see you. I mentioned there that you were right there at the start of it when the IPL started up in 2007-8. Obviously, a bit of a risk that you took investing into a tournament that didn't exist. So you took that risk. It's turned out a very successful investment, I'm sure. But how should we and how do you measure success for Rajasthan Royals? What are the metrics by which you might measure success? Is it, how much the franchise is now worth, or is it indeed, how many tournaments you've won or not won in the period that you've been involved?
Look, I think there's lots of metrics you track, but I think probably the two most critical metrics for us are the number of engaged fans, because that sort of drives everything. That drives your on the commercial side. So, we track that very closely. And then clearly on-field performance. And all that's really changed, I think, for us on-field performances for the first probably 10 years or so, we had to be realistic about what our on-field objectives were. And, we made no secret of the fact that our objective was very much to see if we could get into the playoffs. And that was largely because for the first 10 years of the tournament, the franchises were losing money. And so balancing sort of on-field performance with the financial side was harder. Now that the franchises are profitable, our on-field objective is to win and do the best that we possibly can. And so you've seen that shift in terms of the funds that we spend on players.
Yeah, I was slightly taking the mickey out of Nas, wondering whether Rajasthan were his type of team, because in the early days you did have a reputation of being a little bit of a penny pinching team. You won it in the first year. Let's talk a little bit about the influence of Shane Warne, who was your captain in that first year, and also reputationally, because you weren't spending as much money, your reputation was of a team that was using the data and the stats very smartly, and whether that, because everybody else was kind of as caught up in that sense now, and whether that edge no longer exists in a way that it did for you.
Yeah, but look, there's different questions in there. I mean, firstly, I suspect Nasser's team is Chennai because he likes to sort of sound smart.
Correct.
Generally backs the winners after they've won. But the question you're asking about sort of finding a point of difference or finding an edge, I mean, look, it's very easy to sound smart with hindsight. And the truth about that first season was, we bought a few players that perhaps were undervalued by other franchises, players like Shane Watson and Sahil Tanvir, and they made a huge difference. But a huge part of that success was down to sort of Shane Warne's innovation, Shane Warne's leadership, and frankly, Shane Warne's personality. And so you can't, we can talk about being the Moneyball team, but when I look back at the data and the techniques that we were using, actually they were pretty basic is the truthful answer. I think we've tried to find points of difference over time. As you both know, my world is technology and data, and so it's not surprising that features heavily in the way we approach it. Leadership and aligned leadership. Warne's obviously well famed for what he did for us in the early years, but people sometimes forget what Rahul Dravid did for us. And that was probably our period of greatest consistency. We consistently made the playoffs. We consistently made the Champions League. But to the second part of your question, the franchises have definitely caught up with each other, and the margins between them, the ability to find an edge is getting tougher and tougher and tougher. In that first season, simply having 2 cover points was a massive innovation. And Warnie's field settings were seen as groundbreaking. But with the number of analysts, the size of the support staffs that teams employ now, we are constantly looking for those points of difference, but they are getting harder to find.
Manoj talked there about character of Shane Warne, who I always think would have made a fantastic captain of Australia if given the opportunity on a permanent basis. I know he did it for a few games. It's an interesting one, isn't it, about leadership and captaincy by charisma or character, which is how he would have done it.
And by cricket brain. I mean, he ticked virtually every single box. The cricket brain, we worked with him, and the gut feel for the game. He often called things before they happen, just before they happen. He has a feel, and so that's a good combination. Manoj and the data, albeit very sort of basic data at that and all those years ago, but that combined with a gut feel, which I always feel a team should have, even an Owen Morgan team or a Josh Butler team or a Dhoni team or whoever, these successful captains, that they have the data, but they have a captain that has gut feel. And one thing we knew with Shane was his gut feel for cricket, and his cricket brain was second to none. But as Manoj touched on there, the character, Shane believed that he could win a cricket match from any position. I think it was the Adelaide Test match where England rocked up 550 or something, and he walked into the dressing room and told them we could still win from here, and he bowled England out on the last day. That was Shane. He had a great self-belief. So he was a fantastic cricketer, fantastic cricket brain, and a smart move from Mr. Manoj Badale. Was that a Manoj decision to go for Shane?
Actually, it was heavily influenced by at the time the very very old friend called Ravi Krishnan who was working at IMG. It was heavily influenced by him because what people forget is Warne had actually retired 2 years before the IPL, so he wasn't actually on any sort of list of potentials. But I got a call from Ravi saying, look, Warne's really up for this, and I did. And it'll make you laugh. I did effectively do a bit of a job interview before the tournament because actually, if you can think back to then, there were lots of questions about, was he past it, the off-field stuff. So we did spend a couple of hours together in February, and the thing that came across was, I mean, it's funny looking back. I mean, the IPL was sort of made for Shane Warne. It had everything. It had the razzmatazz, it had the off-field excitement, and the thing that perhaps a lot of the cricket fans and even you two to some extent won't have seen about Warne is he actually had a very astute business brain, and also he embraced innovation, which is not always true of the cricket greats. And so it was a privilege to work with him.
Can I talk to you a little bit about one or two of the players that you've got this year? You haven't won it since that opening.
As you keep reminding me.
That opening edition. You were fifth last year, weren't you? Kind of mid-table mediocrity.
Yeah, look, we also got to the final the year before. So, I mean, we just, if we're going
to... Tell us about young Jaiswal. We were blown away by him in the Test series and the way that he played. We've seen his cricket in that Test series. Tell us a little bit about the young man and his character.
We actually picked him up in the last cycle, and he'd had an extraordinary under-19 World Cup, and we paid what was then deemed to be, a lot of money for a player that hadn't played first-class cricket or indeed IPL, and then we retained him. He was one of our three retentions coming into, one of our four retentions coming into this cycle. So we've known him for a long time. I mean. And as you know, because you've both got kids in your 20s, whenever you talk about these players and these characters and these individuals, they're changing all the time. I mean, I had dinner with him on Thursday night actually in Mumbai, and I was saying to my wife, it's amazing how Yash has changed in the 6 months since he was with us in Devon. So these characters are changing, and again, for the people watching, sometimes we don't appreciate how rapid that change is. I mean, this is a guy who a year ago was probably earning $500,000 a year in total from a background where he used to sleep on the side of a pitch and the groundsman's tent to 9 months later, he's now getting $250,000 for a day's photo shoot. And so, we often judge these players by what they do on the pitch without perhaps appreciating the pressures that they're subjected to off the pitch, and you were both great within the England context, but what that means for a young man in India where you can basically no longer go out of your house, where you've got people hanging outside of your flat to get selfies with you. How that changes, and so where I think you're going with the question to some extent is how he handles the off field is going to be his, and that's what we talked about for 3 or 4 hours over dinner, is going to be almost more important than what's put in front of him on the field.
That was going to be my question, actually. Do you sense that he is surrounded by good people, and therefore, the challenge that you've outlined there, which I agree with you, that is the great challenge for any young kind of up and coming star of Indian cricket, is how to handle all the attention, this kind of goldfish bowl that they live in. Do you get the sense that he is surrounded by good people and has good people to talk to and be advised by, so that those challenges are more easily overcome?
Yeah, look, I like to think as a franchise we're pretty good at supporting those players. I mean, championing potential and realizing dreams has always been our mantra since Ravi Jadeja played for us in 2008. So I would say it, but I think he's in the right franchise to get that support. I think Rahul Dravid, as the India coach, has been already hugely important to him and will be. You both know Rahul. There are very few wiser heads. But the question you asked was literally the topic of dinner, which is how do you advise a young man like that to build a structure around him to deal with everything that's going to come at him? And I think the honest answer, and I think if he was on this podcast, he'd say no, he doesn't have that structure yet. But hopefully over the next 4 to 6 months, we can help him put that in place.
And he's part of a seriously good top three. I mean, that's the amazing thing. I look at the IPL. We'll get on to the side you have this year, but I look at all those IPL sides and the players in there. But you have Joss Buttler, one of the all-time white ball greats. You've got Jaiswal, who's going to be one of the greats, in my opinion, in multi-format. And you have Sanju Samson coming in at number 3 and captain. I saw him on Star Sports the other day talk about you approaching him in Dubai or someone saying, will you be captain, and how he reacted to that. Was it a difficult decision to make Sanju? I mean, you've already mentioned the likes of Warne and Dravid. You've gone for someone with maybe not as much experience.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the truthful answer is it was a difficult decision for the reasons that you intimate, which is, he wasn't a proven captain. But I think it was a long-term decision. And again, when you talk about, having a great top three, you're talking about that in cricketing terms. And clearly I would agree with you. We've also got a great top three, in terms of character. I mean, you couldn't meet finer human beings than Joss Buttler and Sanju Samson. And obviously you both know Joss, but, in terms of humility, in terms of curiosity, in terms of character, we're really, really privileged. And when you're picking a captain, again, as you both know, of course the cricket matters, but the character, the value set that they create for the franchise, the environment that they create for the franchise, because again, to try and sort of share things that the fans won't necessarily see, is that melding together of cultures, egos, players playing for $50,000, other players playing for $2 million, and actually bringing that together generally in the space of about 10 days before then literally living with each other for 2 months. That sort of, like I personally, as Nas would say, as a non-cricketer, I find the managerial side of pulling all of that together as interesting as the sort of, how good the strike rate of your top three is. We're also blessed actually with some other big characters. I mean, Ashwin and Yuzi Chahal are big characters. Someone like Trent Boult, who's been around franchise cricket, and pretty much experienced every. And when we're putting those teams together, you have to get that blend of experience. I hope that 2 players that you're talking about at the end of this tournament are Dhruv Jurel and Riyan Parag, because we're as excited by the potential of those 2 players as we were last year about players like Jaiswal.
We saw Jurel get a start in the Test series recently. Played brilliantly in that second innings of the Ranchi Test match when he showed his character, I suppose, above all, but he certainly looked a top-class wicket-keeper batter as well. Nash, you were saying just before Manoj came on, actually, you noticed he'd picked up a contract from BCCI the other day, and the balance, Manoj, between the control of the players, they are your players in terms of the franchise and the IPL, but they're also under a central contract from BCCI. Does that work very easily? As in, whilst the IPL is on, they are yours, and then beyond that, they're at the beck and call of the BCCI.
Yeah, again, the honest answer would be it works pretty well. There's always areas you'd like to keep pushing on. Clearly, the medical side of it is really important, given how much these players are being asked to play across multiple formats. And we're without Prasidh Krishna again this season, and that's tough as a franchise when you've bet sort of 7 or 8% of your entire player spend on a particular player, and then that player is unavailable for the whole tournament. That hurts you. So the medical side is an area where I think we're trying to work much harder. I think it's easier in the sense that the IPL and the BCCI are very much one. I mean, the IPL is so important to the BCCI, and they see that. You don't have battles about availability of players. The BCCI creates a window. You still have that challenge, and it affects the value ascribed to some of the international players, because there are some countries where the players are going to be fully available, and there are some countries where the likelihood of players pulling out is greater, England being kind of one of them. So you see that, but you see that in the values ascribed to the players.
As an owner, we see it in all sports, really, the impact, the interference. What type of owner are you? Are you someone that, watching it in your offices, you've got another job, hundreds of jobs from what I've seen going on around the world? Are you got the cricket on, and are you picking up your phone to Kumar saying, what's he doing at number 5? Why is he playing? Or do you stay completely out of cricket matters? Because I've seen you play.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty perfect, actually. Ownership, I think, would be my assessment. No, look, like everyone involved in the IPL, I mean, again, back to that thing I said at the start, it's so easy to sound smart with hindsight. The IPL's been this great success. Gosh, weren't you? None of us knew it was going to be this big. I remember, Nas, when you referred to T20 as club cricket in my back garden once. But anyway, none of us really knew how big this thing was going to get. And I think I certainly had no idea what sports ownership really meant. And the sort of amusing story not that amusing, but the story I was telling is I remember Googling in 2008 how to be a sports owner. What does franchise ownership mean? And there was very little out there. It was one of the reasons, actually, Simon Hughes and I wrote that book about A New Innings, to try and sort of unpack what ownership means, what sports ownership, what the franchise ownership has evolved to. But the answer to your question, Ash, is of course you're passionate. Of course you do have conversations. And of course, sometimes you ask questions at inopportune moments. But Kumar Sangakkara as well as many of the names, and the beauty of having a sort of serious grown up in charge of the cricket is he's able to manage the unnecessary questions from me sometimes, but you have got to let the professionals try and do their job.
Can we talk about the IPL more generally and how it's changed and progressed over the long period of time now since that opening edition? I mean, you obviously took the risk. You said it's easy to see in hindsight, but nobody knew at the time how big it was going to be. But I kind of liken, as an owner, you have no responsibility to produce players. You haven't have to kind of build a ground, so your outlay has been minimal as such. And I kind of think about it in a way that I think about newspapers sometimes. When the digital world kind of transformed and upended newspapers gave a lot of their content away for free. The aggregators then came along and kind of picked away and kind of grew their own business model on the back of that. And I sometimes feel like that about the IPL ownership, that the players were almost given to you. I mean, I know you've got to buy them in an auction, but your initial outlay is minimal, really.
Mm.
Do you feel therefore you've got lucky in that sense?
I mean, look, that's born out of your sort of northern bitterness, that we've done so well out of it. But clearly there's some truth to the narrative that you just described. I wouldn't say our outlay was insignificant. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, even as the cheapest franchise, you were contractually signing up to pay $70 million for a tournament that didn't exist in a format that hadn't been played in that country, in a country that at the time was, was hardly an economic superpower. I mean, the transfer. We talked about the transformation in IPL. The transformation in the IPL is largely because of the transformation in India that's gone on over the last 15 years. So, signing up to $70 million, investing, we didn't make a profit for the first 10 years, across the sort of franchises. I mean, we actually did because of our very, very miserly approach to player spend. But, if you look at the investment across the 8 founding franchises, something like $250 million went into the game before a profit was made. Now I think that's quite a big outlay, and quite a big economic risk. And if you put that in the context of investments made into cricket by broadcasters, by sponsors, etc., that was an enormous amount of money. So I think, an accurate depiction of history would be that the BCCI made an enormous investment in the IPL, but so did the ownership group. And without that investment, I don't think the IPL would have been as big as it's become. It's not just the macroeconomic environment that's driven that success. You need investment, which I'm sure we're going to come on to in the context of the England game, but you don't build properties of scale without significant investment.
And the changing face of the IPL as well is that, Ath mentioned you don't produce your own cricketers, but you have to find cricketers. Your scouting system, Jasprit Bumrah is the classic example of John Wright seeing him play in a tournament. He's playing in Ahmedabad or wherever, and look at where Bumrah is now. Because of the IPL, it's not just Mumbai. I noticed Mumbai just won their 42nd Ranji Trophy, but the spread of the game is all over India. You've got so many players playing from different parts. Your scouting system becomes even more important, that you are finding young talent, surely.
Completely right, Nas. I mean, if I tell you, what's the numbers that are documented on the internet and whatever, the dollars that we spend on the players. But if I look at our P&L, I mean, we're spending maybe 12 to $13 million on players. We're spending close to $4 to $5 million on off-field support, analytics, scouting, cricket infrastructure. Now, if you think about that in the context of when you played the game and what was being spent on that support infrastructure, those are extraordinary sums that are leading, I think, to innovation, growth, new players coming into the IPL. I mean, Drew Jarrell had never played first-class cricket before he made his debut for us. We've got something like 15 players who made their IPL debut for us, who've gone on to then represent first-class, their Ranji sides, or represent India. So I like to think that the IPL has also made massive contributions back into, the game that existed before.
How do you see things over the next few years? We've talked about the rapid growth there, a startup that has suddenly, taken off. Do you see that level of growth continuing over the next few years, or is it inevitable that things will flatten off a little bit?
Again, it's an interesting question, because I don't think you can divorce the growth of the IPL at one level from the growth of India. And, if this were a business podcast, we'd be talking about, this being India's the next decade being India's. Most of the sort of banking reports and these advisors that are paid sort of millions to commentate on these things would talk about or will talk about how, post the elections that are going to happen right in the middle of the IPL, assuming, as I think most of us expect, we're going to have a pretty sort of stable political outcome following that. India is going to become such a massive economic powerhouse in the world, and the Indian diaspora, of which Nas and I are part, are becoming ever more influential and powerful, and that's a great sort of driver of the growth of the IPL, and that's so I guess my answer to your question, Ath, is I think the IPL is just going to get bigger and bigger, and actually its share within the game is also going to grow. But I think the biggest impact of the IPL will be how it continues to grow the game worldwide.
Just, are there any headwinds at all? I mean, Ath touched on 74 games, 10 sides now. Can an Indian audience, and this is a stupid question, I check myself as I say it, can an Indian audience ever have too much cricket? Or is just the love of cricket just more? We've just seen, and I'll come on to it, we've just seen what's happened in the WPL and the love of RCB. Can they ever have too much cricket in India?
Yeah, actually, I don't think it's a silly question at all, because, actually last year there was a big bit of consumer research that was done, which across sort of sports preferences, different demographics within India, and for the first time, the under 10s, the number one sport was identified as soccer. So I do think you can never be complacent about the future, and we've got to continue engaging the next generation. Again, all three of us have kids. We know attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. One of the headwinds is that the IPL games are getting too long. I mean, you never thought we'd ever say that about a T20 game, but they are getting too long. They're going on too late into the evening, and that's something that obviously the ECB tried to address with the 100 format. That's something I think we've got to be very cognizant of. The reality is most kids now are consuming the IPL in a completely different way to the way you and I watch cricket, or the first generation of IPL fans watch cricket. So how we support that OTT growth, the digital growth, how we package the content that you guys are a part of producing and distribute that. There's an awful lot of stuff that we've got to keep innovating. And the part of the world that I spend a lot of time watching to kind of glean learnings from, is America. And you look at how, what the US does with its packaging of broadcast. You look at the broadcast experience. You look at how they turn the draft into this incredible sort of multimedia showcase. There's still so much for us to do in terms of how we innovate and present the game if we're going to keep engaging young fans. And for me, that's the headwind that you have to because if you engage fans, everything else takes care of itself.
Now, you're a pretty shrewd operator. You would say there is a heck of a lot of growth for women's sport and women's cricket, having just seen what's happened in the WPL and the crowds they've had and the reaction to RCB winning it. Is there plans for a Rajasthan women's side? Is that a Rajasthan decision or is it a BCCI decision? How does that work?
It's a bit of both. So we did bid for, as you know, the franchise auction was last year. We bid for a team. Rajasthan wasn't one of the chosen locations, so actually we bid for a team up in the northeast where we play two of our home games. We would love to have a women's team. We hosted the first ever sort of mini kind of copycat version of a women's IPL back in 2013. We've got a women's team in Barbados. We've got a women's team in PAL. And your overall point, by the way, about the growth in women's cricket is just extraordinary. And I was shocked by the images of what went on in Bangalore after they won the women's team. So we definitely want a team, but the BCCI has to expand the league, decide that Rajasthan is going to be a place where a team can play, and then we can participate. But I'd love to have a team, and actually I credit English cricket with some of that sort of turbocharging of the women's game. I think the 100 and what the 100 did for the women's game was fabulous. And there's a ton of growth there, which is really exciting.
Before I come on to the general picture of the world game, because what you've suggested there about the IPL only getting bigger and bigger is obviously going to have some impact elsewhere. But just before we go on to that, you're a serial investor. Has this investment been your best one?
Look, it's definitely been right up there. And there's has it been our best? I mean, I'm not trying to evade the question, but it slightly depends what metric, money multiple or cash in, cash out. But it's definitely been certainly one of our top 2 or 3.
You mentioned there that you've also invested into Barbados and PAL. Like many of the franchises now, you're looking at other competitions, other teams around the world. Going back to your earlier point about the IPL is going to get bigger and eating up chunks of the game, where that's going to present challenges for the rest of the game. How do you see it evolving?
Yeah, look, I think words are really important. You see, I mean, even in that question, when you talk about eating up chunks of the game, right? There's an implicit anxiety. There's and actually, I'm not trying to pick a fight because we've had many over the years, but there is this sort of sense that the IPL growing and taking over leagues is like a bad thing, right? And I heard someone say to me the other day, one of the governing bodies is very worried about whether all the franchise when they auction the franchises, whether they're all going to be IPL owned. And to which my response was, well, why does that matter? Surely all that matters, your only objective function, I think, as someone that loves the game, should be how do we make the game bigger? Right? We make the game bigger, we all benefit. Players benefit, fans. More investment goes into the infrastructure that supports fans. The fan experience gets better. The best players get paid more. People make choices to play cricket rather than other sports. Parts of the world that never got cricket get cricket. So all we should be thinking about is making the game bigger. And I do think the IPL franchises are going to continue to expand their international reach. I think the smarter leagues will welcome that. I think South Africa is a really interesting case study. When you look at their, and when you look at South Africa, because the franchises are quote IPL owned, has made zero difference to how engaged the local fans have got behind the teams. In fact, some of our PAL Royals fan base is more passionate about the pink and more passionate about the Royals than the fan base we've had in Rajasthan for years. So eating chunks of the game is a way of thinking about it. I like to think about it as the IPL spreading its wings is going to help grow the game.
It's obviously had a massive impact on South Africa's test team when they're taking a third 11 to New Zealand, by the way. But all that brings us very nicely onto England. And
just before we get there, I'm not going to. I do think that's a really interesting point, though. That South African one, which is that problem that happened in January, which is clearly a problem, right? That they took a second 11 or third 11. Is that because of the IPL coming to SAT20?
No.
Is that because of Graham Smith having the courage to go out and create a new tournament, or is it because you've got a complete lack of alignment and thought between the governing body and between the tournament organisers to ensure that clash doesn't happen? And again, you and I have had this conversation, but governing bodies, in my opinion, have lots of things to do, and in certain cases, have too many things to do. But if we just got good at scheduling, we could make life so much better for the players and so much better for the fans. And if we said, our core skill set is going to be scheduling, you'd avoid all this nonsense.
But the problem with that is that the growth of franchise cricket has been so exponential. I said before you came on, you see one player play here, then the next day he's playing for a completely different side at the other side of the world. That makes scheduling really tricky. And it's something and that means there has to be consequences for any action. There's a reaction and a consequence, which means Test cricket has been pushed to the margins. Domestic cricket has been pushed to the margins. It becomes very difficult. And it's something that's often labeled and thrown at people like you, Manoj, is that what's the saying that you have the price of everything, but don't understand the value of it. Now, the value and the emotion of Test match cricket, the value and the emotion of county cricket, for some, it's not about the money, it's about sport and what we're missing out on and losing out on and what's been dwindling away. What would you say to those people?
Well, firstly, Test cricket, as you both know, is actually my preferred format of the game. It's, I've watched you two block your way around the world for many a day, but you won't find a bigger proponent of Test cricket and someone keener to see it survive. But unfortunately, numbers don't lie. Economics will always prevail, and I come back to engaged fans. The reason Test cricket's had a bit of a renaissance in the last couple of years is because we've had a brand of Test cricket that's been played, actually led as much by England as anyone, that's really engaged fans again. And I come back to, all I care about is that the game gets bigger and the game survives for the next 50 years. And you can't go against the tide of what fans want to watch. And yes, there are people like the three of us who are completely engaged by that Test cricket. There are countries like England, Australia, India who have the resources to support and subsidise the growth of a Test game. But the Test game, like it or not, has to continue to evolve if it's going to survive and own a piece in the schedule. And we talked about lots of things over the years, but when 74% of all Test matches are finishing within 4 days, you can make a big difference to the scheduling challenge by asking the question about whether or not Test cricket should be played in 4 days. So I think for every problem, there's a solution. I think Test cricket has, we've talked about many a time, has a massive role to play, and we've got to preserve it. I don't know if all the countries that play Test cricket and can afford to prioritise Test cricket as their dominant format, but certainly the big 4 or 5 can.
I'd pick you up on one aspect of that before we just push on to the question I wanted to get to about England and private investment. You talk about market forces always win out, which is absolutely the case, but it's not always a kind of what I would call a fair market, in the sense that lots of decisions that administrators make are clearly pushing people towards one format over another. In England, when one competition is given the school holidays, a block in August, cheaper tickets, all the kind of things to create the preconditions for success. That's not always necessarily a kind of free and fair market. But let's turn our attentions to England, because it's going to be the story, I think, over the next year or two, as the ECB grapple with what to do with the 100 in particular, but also this the private investment or private equity that is clearly going to come into the game. It's just a matter of how it will come in, when it will come in, what form it will come in. First of all, it's an obvious question, but as a serial investor, somebody who believes absolutely in private enterprise, you presumably believe that the ECB should give the green light to private investment and private equity into the English game.
Definitely, but to be clear, cricket's had private investment for tens and hundreds of years, right? It's the nature of that private investment. I mean, the private investment in club cricket has been the guy that pays for the sponsorship to allow the club to go around. The private investment in domestic cricket is Sky Sports funding the English game for the last 7 or 8 years. So private investment has always been needed. It's the nature of that private investment. I think for England to seize the opportunity that it has with the growth of the women's game, with the way the hundreds engage young people, the game needs serious marketing dollars to be invested. And yeah, I think private investments are a good place to go look for that.
And if you were in charge of the 100, if the ECB rang you up and said, Manoj, you've done a pretty good job, Rajasthan Royals, you're a good business mind, you love the game of cricket. If you were in charge of the 100, what would you do with it?
I think a few things. I think I would bring in private investment. I think I would really think about how we can embrace the IPL as opposed to perhaps fixate on trying to compete with the IPL. Like I would, the reality is there are so many economic advantages to having IPL franchises involved in a domestic tournament. They kind of outweigh any sense of kind of losing control of The third thing, I'd set some pretty strict non-financial criteria for who the owners and the custodians of those franchises can be, because, as both of you have said on many occasions, it is a game. It's not just purely about the economic side of things. So I'd be quite thoughtful about that. And I think, as I look at franchise evolution, across the world, that hasn't always been the case, and that's come back to bite. One of the topics that isn't talked about enough, actually, in my view, we talk about lots of threats and headwinds, but as more owners, as more corporations, as more individuals come into the game, that existential threat of fixing gambling. A lot of these minor leagues exist purely on the back of the revenues they generate for the gaming companies. I think you've got to be quite worried about that if you're a custodian or a governor of the game. So I think there's some real issues to think about there. I'd have a team in the Southwest. I spend too much time down there, and I don't think the Southwest is properly represented. And I'd get on with it, and I would get this capital in quickly, because the real competition is not the IPL. The real competition is what's happening in the US, what's happening in the Caribbean. And to your point 15 minutes ago, the schedule is getting ever more compressed. We should have, if not the second biggest short form league, certainly the second or third biggest short form league in this country, and we need to get on with it.
One of the key questions is whether to sell the kind of tournament as a whole or the teams. ECB had an offer from Bridgepoint a year or 18 months ago that was pretty well talked about. Do you have a view which way to go on that? I mean, obviously there are many models around the world, aren't there? Hybrid models where IPL, they've sold teams but kept control of the middle, and there's lots of hybrids there.
Actually, just one other point to Nasser's previous question. The other thing I'd get really focused on if I were in charge of the 100 is how do you get the very best players in the world playing, right? Because at the end of the day, the quality of the cricket drives the fan engagement. And we have a good tournament, but if you talk to the players who play in the 100 versus SAT 20 versus IPL, that we mustn't ever take our sights off of the importance of having the very, very best players. I mean, the IPL is still a big step up from any of those domestic leagues, and the 100 shouldn't, that gap shouldn't be as big as it is, and that comes back to, again, being able to pay what you need to pay to get those players, which is why that private investment is so important. But on to your question, Athers. I mean, look, I've got a very clear view on this, which is I think private investment into franchises is fine. Perhaps you two don't always give me enough credit. I'm actually not just a believer in unfettered capitalism. I'm a believer in regulated capitalism. And I think you do need strong regulators and governors and governing bodies, and giving up too much control, giving up control around the governance of the game, is quite a risky thing to do. So, years ago when we put the book together, we were really clear, which is sell the equity in the franchises, grow the tournament, bring private capital there, but make sure you've got a really strong governing body. And if at some point you want to dilute that in the future, you can. But the BCCI model, I think, is a good one, which is, we don't have unfettered capitalism within the IPL. I've got a very, very powerful counterparty who is the BCCI.
Small stuff, but important stuff. Would the format have to change? I mean, would Rajasthan and Mumbai, if they came over and took over London or whatever, would they wanted a 100-ball tournament, or would they want uniformity?
Rajasthan are getting outbidded by Mumbai Indians. Don't worry about that for London.
I meant both of them.
I mean, look, apart from changing the name of the tournament from the 100 in English to 100 in Hindi, I don't think anything will change. No, look, I think the 100. Again, I wasn't a proponent or a fan of another format into a game that, in my view, already has a proliferation of formats. I know what problem Tom Harrison and co were trying to solve, which was making sure the game wasn't getting too long. I think there are other ways to do that. I think having made the investment in the 100, you might as well stick with the 100. And I think when you talk to players and coaches, subtleties and the differences between preparing for a T20 game and a 100 game are marginal. So no, I probably wouldn't change the format.
It's been fascinating. Let's just turn our attentions back to the IPL. Your first game is Sunday, I think, against Lucknow. Presumably, you'll be heading out shortly after that. Your ground still relatively small size, isn't it? I think 25,000 is the limit, isn't it, for your ground?
That's about as polite as you've ever been, Alf. Look, we have probably one of the worst grounds, which is keeping with our low-cost image. And yeah, it is. It's a small ground, and by the time you've given the associations and the local government their allocation of tickets, it's more like sort of 15,000 fans. But it's always packed.
You'll sell that out every game, will you?
Yeah, I mean, the afternoon games can be a bit tricky. And actually, as it happens, our first game is an afternoon game. And that's, again, sort of slightly contextual because Rajasthan in April is incredibly hot and it's an uncovered ground. And frankly, it's not a particularly good fan experience, in 40 degrees heat in open stands. So afternoon, but I think what your question is getting at is certainly for the evening games, we'd have a massive sellout. And we now play 2 home games up in the northeast in Guwahati, which is a much bigger, much more modern stadium, sort of closer to 45,000. And again, there'll be absolute sellouts, and Calcutta will be sellouts for all their games at 70,000. So I do think actually one of the things franchises and the BCCI working together have got a bit of a responsibility to start investing in is improving the fan experience in the stadium. But yeah, it's going to be well supported. The slight nuance this year, because there'll be a lot of people watching this who'll be pretty frustrated at the lack of visibility on the schedule. The nuance this year,
they've just put a thing out for the first 2 or 3 weeks, haven't they? Basically,
exactly. So, for example, we have to play all of our games in Rajasthan, all of our home games, by April the 20th, which makes it quite difficult for the organisers. So, in previous election years, we've ended up going to the Middle East or going to South Africa. At least this year, we're playing it in India in front of Indian fans.
I always think fondly, in a way, of your ground, though, because it was there in '93, England's first ODI that was played in Jaipur. That was the very first game in India played on satellite television, really, which was the start of this great transformation and revolution of cricket in India in many ways, in terms of the television impact and satellite television impact, and clearly from where things were to where they are now, it's unrecognizable in all kinds of ways. So give us a prediction. Where are you going to finish? I mean, IPL.
Well, 17, from what we've heard,
they're holding up the trophy in the end.
Well, he's the best owner we've heard from this podcast. He's got the best captain. Kumar's the best coach, and he's got the best top 3. So
I know.
Going to win it.
If only we could add you, Nas, to that team. It would be...
Am I right in thinking that you gave Sanju Samson Nasser's phone number to talk captaincy a year or so ago? I mean, could you not have come up with a better alternative?
I did actually. What was sad was Sanju, said it was the biggest waste of 15 minutes of his life.
You're better than that, man.
Actually, again, one thing the fans perhaps won't appreciate is because this season, and I will answer your question, but because this season is the 3rd year in a 3 cycle, in the cycle, you'll actually see statistically that the margins between the 10 teams are really, really fine. Like the IPL, that's the brilliance of the IPL, which was built on the simple ethos of every team should be able to win every game. That's particularly true in the 3rd year of a cycle. So this is going to be the toughest year to make predictions. Look, I think we've got a pretty good side. I think when you look back at the end of this season, injuries will play a role. So actually keeping your players fit for 8 to 9 weeks, especially sort of fast bowlers, and how that plays out, the criticality of that. If we've got a bit of an Achilles this year, we've got to get that fast bowling at the back of the innings. You look at our top 6; it's as good as anyone's. You look at our spinners; they're as good as anyone's, as England found out in the case of Ashwin this winter. So, look, I'd be happy with playoffs, and I'd be disappointed if we didn't make the playoffs. But that was true last year after getting to the final 2 years ago, which you didn't mention, and I had to put in there. Last year felt like a real disappointment, and all I can tell you is we finished fifth and missed the playoffs by, I think, net run rate, and the team were absolutely gutted. So let's see how we go, and eventually it would be nice to just not allow you to keep reminding me we've only ever won one tournament, which, by the way, is one more than 2 or 3 other teams.
Absolutely.
That answer was nearly long as an IPL game, to be honest. Brilliant.
Manoj, we wish you well, obviously. Hope for a successful tournament and a successful one for Rajasthan. Thanks for joining us. It's been fascinating.
Thanks, and thanks for having me on, and thanks for kind of all the support that you guys and Sky give to the IPL, which is obviously great because we talked a lot about engaged fans in India, but actually one of the things that's amazing actually is how the IPL fandom has grown outside of India as well. So thank you for promoting it.
Well, you can watch every game of the IPL live on Sky. The first game is Friday afternoon, defending champions CSK against RCB.